Hi everyone, I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado, and you are watching All Up in Your Business. On this episode of All Up in Your Business, we're going to continue the conversation about the differences between independent contractors and employees. But before we get into it, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. In my last video, we talked about how the IRS determines if someone is an independent contractor or an employee. Quick summary. It comes down to the degree of control the company has over the worker and the independence that the worker exercises. As I mentioned in that video, not only do we have to be concerned about the IRS and the federal government's laws and rules regarding worker classification, but we also have to worry about the state's laws. As an employer or company, if you hire somebody to do work for you, you must be sure to properly classify that worker as either an employee or an independent contractor. If you misclassify an employee as an independent contractor, you could be liable to the IRS for employment taxes. You could also be liable under state laws in terms of minimum wage or meal and rest breaks. You could also be liable under federal law with regard to the Fair Labor Standards Act. You also risk being liable for things you may not have anticipated or planned for, such as workers' compensation or vicarious liability for the actions of the employee. So needless to say, it is really important that you understand the differences between an employee and a contractor so you can properly classify the people who work for you. Generally speaking, there are two different types of tests that are used to determine if a worker is an independent contractor or an employee. There's the common law test and the ABC test. The IRS rules that I discussed in the last video fall under the common law test, which looks at the behavioral control, financial control, and the relationship of the parties. The ABC test uses three factors that are in some ways very similar to the common law test. But the ABC test focuses on whether there's an absence of control, if services provided by the worker are related to the services provided by the company, and if the worker is customarily engaged in an independent trade or business. Each state has its own laws regarding worker classification and what makes somebody an independent contractor versus an employee, and their own laws regarding the rights of employees and contractors. Some states use a variation of the common law test, and some use a variation of the ABC test, and some use a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But even though two states may use the same test, the exact way that the test is applied in a given situation or the way it's spelled out in the state's laws will look very different from state to state. And in most cases, we need to focus on the laws of the state where the worker is located, not just the state where the company is located or registered. So that's what we're going to cover this time around. Since each state has its own set of laws and rules, I obviously cannot go over the laws of all the states. I'm going to focus on Colorado and California. Colorado because that's where I'm licensed and where my law practice is based, and California because that's where I live and because it was a hot topic over recent years. To be clear, I am not licensed to practice law in California. I live in California and I operate my business remotely from California, but I am a Colorado lawyer and a Colorado-based law firm. If you have questions about properly classifying your workers, you should definitely consult with an attorney who is licensed in your state. Let's start with the great state of Colorado, since that's where I'm licensed and those are the laws that I deal with most often. Colorado uses kind of a variation of the ABC test and focuses on the degree of control and if the worker is engaged in an independent business. Our statute in Colorado says, in part, any individual who performs services for pay for another shall be deemed to be an employee, unless the individual is free from control and direction in the performance of the service and such individual is customarily engaged in an independent trade, occupation, profession, or business related to the service performed. So, in other words, employee is the default classification. Anybody who performs a service for another is by default considered an employee unless they are free from control and direction and are customarily engaged in an independent trade, occupation, profession, or business. Just like with the IRS, there are a number of different factors that are taken into account to demonstrate if the worker is working independently and free from control and direction. It must be shown that the company, the one for whom the services are being performed, does not require the individual to work exclusively for the company, does not establish a quality standard for the worker. The company can provide plans and specifications regarding the work, but they can't oversee the actual work or instruct the worker as to how the work will be performed. The company doesn't pay a salary or an hourly rate instead of a fixed or contract rate, doesn't terminate the work of the worker during the contract period unless the worker violates the terms of the contract or fails to produce a result that meets the specifications of the contract. The company doesn't provide more than minimal training, doesn't provide tools or benefits to the individual, doesn't dictate the time of performance except maybe a completion schedule and a range of, negotiated and mutually agreeable work hours, doesn't pay the worker personally instead of making payments to the trade or business name of the worker, and does not combine the business operations of the company instead of maintaining all such operations separately and distinctly. Now, you don't necessarily have to satisfy all of those factors. Just because one factor is missing doesn't automatically mean the worker is an employee. And if there's a written contract between the parties that describes the existence of those factors, then that contract can be used to demonstrate that the relationship is that of an independent contractor. The contract can also create a rebuttable presumption that the worker is an independent contractor if the contract includes a disclosure that the worker won't be entitled to workers' compensation benefits and is obligated to pay federal and state income taxes on the money paid to the worker. That means that if the contract states that the company won't require the worker to work exclusively for them, won't provide more than minimal training, won't dictate the time of performance, and so on, and that the worker has to pay their own income taxes and won't receive benefits of workers' compensation, then it's presumed that the worker is an independent contractor. But that's a rebuttable presumption, meaning that it will be taken as true unless somebody else tries to contest it and proves otherwise. It depends on the actual facts of the relationship, not just what the contract says. It doesn't matter if the contract says I'm not going to provide more than minimal training if I am actually providing a lot of training. Just because the contract says I'm going to treat you like an independent contractor doesn't mean that I am, in fact, treating you as an independent contractor. Now, let's talk about California. California was a hot topic over recent years due to their enactment of Assembly Bill 5, or AB-5. People really got their panties in a bunch because California changed the way they determined independent contractor and employee classification. California uses the ABC test. It's not like this is something brand new or groundbreaking. Plenty of other states also use some variation of the ABC test. The idea was that AB-5, this change, would make it easier for employers and workers to determine in advance if a worker is an independent contractor or an employee. Previously, they used a 13-factor test that considered all potentially relevant facts, where no single factor would control. That test, called the Borello test, or maybe it's pronounced Boreo, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was pretty similar to the common law test that the IRS uses. It focused on things like if the worker holds themselves out as being engaged in an occupation distinct from that of the employer, who provides supplies and tools for the worker, if the worker has invested in its business, if the services provided requires a special skill, and so on. They would take all of the 13 factors into consideration, but no single factor would control the determination. The ABC test, on the other hand, has 3 factors, and if one of those factors does not exist, then the worker is not an independent contractor. So under the ABC test, a worker is considered an employee and not an independent contractor unless the employer or the company doing the hiring satisfies all 3 of the following conditions. Number 1, the worker is free from control and direction. 2, the worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the company's business. And 3, the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature that involves the work performed. So, comparing that to the common law test that the IRS uses, the ABC test really isn't all that different. They both ask questions about the behavioral control that the company has over the worker, the work that the worker performs compared to the nature of the company's business, and if the worker is engaged in an independent trade or business. The only real significant difference is that the ABC test says all of these things are important, and if one of these things is missing, then employee. Whereas the common law test is more like, all of these things are important, but just because one thing might be missing doesn't automatically mean employee. AB-5 also carves out exceptions for certain types of professions and other circumstances where they might still apply that multi-factor Borello test instead of the 3-factor ABC test. There are exceptions in some circumstances for people like freelance writers, photographers and videographers, certain occupations in the music industry, and some bona fide business-to-business relationships. There are other requirements that you sometimes have to demonstrate before you can use that multi-factor test instead of the ABC test. But the point is that the ABC test does not strictly apply to all situations and all workers 100% of the time. The other important takeaway here, which is true in both Colorado and California, and actually true with regard to the IRS and other federal laws too, is that the burden of proof is on the employer or, the hiring entity. It's up to the company doing the hiring, not the worker, to demonstrate and prove that the worker is an independent contractor and not an employee. You, as the worker, won't get into trouble with the state or federal governments if you are misclassified as an independent contractor when you're really an employee. It's the company's responsibility to make sure they are properly classifying their workers. I'm going to close this episode out by quickly addressing a question that I've seen pop up a few times in the comments and stuff. If I am the worker and I want to be an independent contractor, I want that freedom and ability to control and dictate my schedule, my work, my life, how do I make sure that I don't fall into that category of employee? I've said before that being an employee or a contractor is not a choice that you get to make. The employer doesn't get to choose if a worker is an employee or not, and the employee doesn't get to choose if they're treated as an independent contractor or not. That determination is based on the facts of the relationship. While that is correct, it's not a choice that either party gets to make. It's kind of incorrect in the sense that you do get to choose how you act and how you provide services to other people and other companies. The best way I can explain it is this. If you want to be treated like an independent contractor, then you have to act like an independent contractor. Act like an independent business owner, because that's what you are. Do the things that a business would normally do. Maybe you operate as an LLC or a corporation. Have a service contract with your clients that defines the scope and nature of your relationship. Market and advertise your services. Take risks and invest in your business. Set boundaries with regard to your work and say no to people who try to treat you as an employee. I, as a self-employed lawyer, am an independent contractor to my clients. If one of my clients was like, hey Aiden, I need you to be available for me more and stop working with your other clients. I want you to dedicate 40 hours a week to helping my business instead. Or if they were like, hey, Aiden, I know our contract says that you're only going to do this one project, but I need you to do this other project instead, and I need you to have it done by tomorrow, and I need you to use this specific program when you do it. I would reply with, no, thank you. That's not how I operate my business. I'm happy to help you, but I'm only going to do so on my terms. So that's the answer. If you want to make sure you're treated as an independent contractor, then you need to make sure you act like an independent contractor. If you are operating a business and need help with determining if your workers are independent contractors or employees, please contact an attorney who is licensed in your state. As you can see, the laws are different in every state and will apply differently in every situation. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. If you're an independent contractor and want to make sure you stay an independent contractor, then contact a lawyer in your state who can help you manage the legal side of your business operations. And finally, if you're a worker who thinks your employer is misclassifying you as an independent contractor when you might actually be an employee, then can you guys guess what I'm about to say? Contact a lawyer who is licensed in your state. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. And again, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.